Hey, it's Mike here, and just a quick update for all of you listening in. As you may have heard, I've recently launched a brand new plugin company called Carve Audio. And the goal of this brand is all about building tools that make your mixing process easier and more intuitive so that you can focus on creativity, fun, and getting pro results, but without any hassle. We just rolled out our first plugin, which is called the Smashburger Compressor, and it's designed to give you more control over shaping your sound and adding that cohesive glue to your mixes, while also bringing in a little bit of character to your tracks. Basically, it takes inspiration from many of my favorite compressors, but with enhanced features and added controls to easily give your tracks more punch, polish, and flavor. And we've got some exciting plugins coming very soon, so if you want to be the first to know what's next, make sure to hop on over to carveaudio.com and join our mailing list. Thanks for listening and happy mixing. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Pete Lyman, and if you're not familiar with Pete, Pete is a mastering engineer. He owns a studio called Infrasonic Mastering. They actually have a couple different locations right now, but he's worked with a bunch of major artists, people like Chris Stapleton, Jason Isbell, Weezer, Panic! At the Disco, Brandi Carlile, and a whole bunch more. And in today's chat, we definitely get into Pete's process behind mastering and his mindset going into new projects. And one of the themes that comes up throughout this interview a lot is this idea of having a lack of confidence and a lack of commitment in the work that people are doing. And it seems to be something that comes up pretty commonly for him as a mastering engineer, where he'll see a lot of mixers that aren't committing to mixes, aren't committing to decisions, and they're leaving so much up to the interpretation of the mastering engineer to basically kind of remix a lot of these projects when really their job should be mastering. And so we talk a lot about that. And Pete shares some great tips as far as how to get over that lack of confidence and some of the things you can do to feel more confident in trusting your decisions, your gut, your speakers, your room, all of that stuff, so that ultimately you can be getting the vision that you hear for your music to come to life in a much easier way. So yeah, we dive into a lot of that in today's conversation. And then as we start to talk about Pete's process, we also get into a really interesting chat about this concept of active listening versus passive listening and how both can offer a different perspective on the tracks that you're working on, which again can help you with feeling more confident in your tracks and committing to your decisions. Because sometimes when you're taking this passive listening approach that he talks about, it allows you to not sweat the small stuff and realize what actually is super important in your mixes. So yeah, there's a ton of great stuff in this episode. So let's just jump right into it. Pete Lyman, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's going great. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and your story and how you get into this stuff, can you give us that background?
Yeah, sure. I'm a mastering engineer. I own a company called Infrasonic, and I am located in Nashville. We also have a studio in Los Angeles, and I've been mastering for about 25, 26 years. So made the move to Nashville from Los Angeles in 2017, and loving it here so far.
How did you get into mastering?
Man, I got into mastering in kind of a roundabout way. I was a musician, and that's what I planned to do with my life. So I grew up playing in a lot of punk rock and hardcore bands and, touring all over the US in super shitty vans and making no money and putting out weird little independent records. And I got interested in recording in the, kind of early mid 90s, primarily because most of the bands that I was involved with didn't have a lot of money to spend in the studio. So my day gig was IT. So right out of high school, I started working for IBM. I went to work for another big IT company. So I was always interested in computers. I sort of got into early, computer, digital audio and 4-track stuff. Eventually, kind of through a roundabout way, I walked into a mastering studio in Los Angeles ran by my mentor, Richard Simpson, and saw my first lacquer get cut. So at that point, I'd already been sort of dipping my toes in kind of digital audio mastering and recording a bunch of bands and doing my own musical projects, but everything changed for me once I saw that first lacquer cut. And that was it. And it was all I could think about. I feel like I've told the story a million times, but it was crazy. After that day, I went back the next day and basically begged Richard Simpson, the engineer, to let me do whatever. I'm like, I'll scrub your toilets every day. I don't care. Let me hang out here and watch this. And then years later, we ended up kind of partnering up, and it just sort of grew organically from there.
That's very cool. Yeah, I mean, the first time you see a lacquer get cut, it's wild. It's just like this crazy technology that you don't know. Like most people have no idea what goes into it.
Yeah, I've cut tens of thousands of lacquers, and I feel the same way every time I cut a record. Still an amazing process. Still my favorite part of mastering.
Yeah, and I think it's just like it's such an art in itself, learning how to do it. And like there's so many minor things that can make it go off the rails. So almost quite literally, like off the grooves. You know?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's, even 25 years later, it's still a constant learning experience.
Very cool. Well, I'd love to, I definitely want to dig into more about your process and all of those things that you've learned through your journey. But I think maybe before we get into that, let's start with just maybe prepping for mastering. From an artist perspective, most people listening to this are musicians themselves that are, trying to figure out how to do this. What are some of the, I guess, what are some of the biggest problems you see as a mastering engineer with the tracks that are being submitted to you?
I think the biggest issue in my mind is just mostly artists that aren't willing to commit to really finishing a mix. So I always tell people, if you're not happy with your mix when you send it to mastering, you're probably not going to be happy with it when you get it back. There's a lot we can do, but I think it's important to make sure you're happy with the overall balance of the mix. At least where most of the instruments are setting, that's important. One of the other things, I might be going off topic a little bit here, but I've just had this happen a few times recently. I think the one other issue is when a artist or engineer doesn't want to commit to a mix before sending it to mastering. And what I mean by that is I've had a handful of engineers send me oh, here's 5 mixers. Here's one 3 dB down. Here's one before clipping. Here's one with, the full limiting. Here's one without mix bus compression. Here's one with all the bullshit I put on it. It's send me the mix that you like, Oftentimes, I just had a project recently where I got 4 versions, and they sort of led me to believe that they wanted me to work from, the mix with the most headroom, without any clipping, without any limiting. And then the end, I just realized, they were actually, in this situation, they were really happy with their mix, and we ended up working with the mix that had all of their vibe baked into it. So I think it's important to finish the mix, make sure that you're ready to move on to mastering. And, I know sometimes there's always things that come up, maybe you hear something come out and jump out that the mastering process sort of enhances. Oftentimes people aren't used to hearing all the details in their mix. And oftentimes you need to go back and maybe make a few mix adjustments. That's not that big of a deal. But I think it's important for people, number one, make sure you're happy with the mix and check your files before sending them. Obviously, there's a ton of administrative stuff that goes into mastering. I mean, as you know, I think 90% of it is quality control and file administration, But I think it's important for, that same level of quality control to happen at the mix engineer's level. Check your mixes. Don't just bounce them and send them out. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times where we've received files where the first 5 seconds are cut off, or there's a middle section missing, or it's a really sloppy fade that we can't fix. It's spend the 4 minutes and check the file and make sure it's good before sending it.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I think of the same thing too. So many times I'll hear little clicks and pops and stuff like that in a track, and someone hasn't taken the time to go through and make sure all the edits are properly done, and fades are there and all that kind of stuff.
That's huge. we spend a lot of time in RX. And it's funny, we joke, it's like, I don't know what we did before RX, you know? So I feel like a good portion of my job and the rest of our engineers' jobs just declicking masters, fixing bad vocal edits. You know, a lot of it is like, I mean, you know, like comped vocals where, you know, there were no crossfades done, and you just, oh, there's a click, there's a click, there's a click, there's a click. So tightening as much of that stuff up as you can before sending it. I will say some of that stuff is, you might not notice it till it gets mastered. So I don't have any problem. That's kind of part of our job, is to help with those things. So, but I think it's important to try to tidy up as much as possible before you send that track in.
For sure. Earlier you were talking about like people not committing to their mixes and that being a big issue for you. Do you find that, like, are there any commonalities in the issues that people have with their mixes?
Yeah. Now, I wouldn't say it's a big issue for me. I would say 90% of the time, I'm fortunate to work with some really great engineers, and I get to work with some really great mixes. But when it does happen, yeah, frankly, it's mostly, you know, usually the biggest culprit is not getting the low end dialed in. So I would say low end and sibilance are, for me, the things that stand out. That obviously there's a lot I can do to address that in mastering, but it's hard for folks with unless you have a tuned room and speakers that are flat really low, you might not know what's going on down there. So, and some of that's just kind of what we do. There's a reason why, you know, I have a really large full resolution monitoring system, because I need to be able to hear that. If you're mixing on a smaller pair of speakers, you're going to maybe miss some of that stuff.
Absolutely. So then do you recommend that, obviously, like, yeah, all those factors you just said, like a tuned room and having good speakers and all that, that's all super, super important. Like, are there any other tips that you would suggest as far as for people who might be in a situation where they're a little limited with their options, like anything that they can do to just check their low end a little bit better, or to make sure it's better prepared for mastering?
Sure. Yeah. And also I'm not saying that you can only do records in a super fancy tuned room with really expensive full resolution speakers. Quite frankly, most of my favorite records were recorded in tiny studios on mid-range consoles and probably mastered in cinder block rooms. So, you know, I mean, like, so I have a lot of love for that kind of guerrilla style recording and mixing, and spent a good portion of my career working with bands like that did everything on 4 tracks and Digio 1s and Digio 2s, and were recording in closets and everything. I love that. But I think I think it's important to understand those limitations, and you really kind of, since you don't have that microscope that we have as mastering engineers, where we go into the same room every day, we have a tuned system. We're used to the monitors. We're used to the way the room loads when we turn up the bass. We know how that feels, and we know when it's right. It's very important to check it on as many sources that you can, and that also that you're familiar with, you know? So that's when that car stereo check is going to be really important.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's just like something you're familiar with, and I've said it before on the podcast. I think that, like, the reason the car stereo check exists is because that's the place where people listen to the most music. So many people aren't actually listening to music on their studio monitors. It's like, you know, those are kind of just in their basement waiting for whenever they're recording something, and so they don't actually learn those speakers well enough to trust them. So, you know, that is often why the car is the place to check, and typically cars will have like subs and stuff like that too, so that helps to have the low end in there too, right?
It's funny, I have an older 2013 Lexus RX 350. It's just a little old SUV, has like 314,000 miles on it. It'll just never die, and I won't get rid of it specifically because of the stereo. It has the best stereo system I have ever heard in a car. And it's sort of just my extra car that I'll never get rid of, because the stereo is phenomenal. And I trust it almost as much as I trust the mains in my mastering room. So, but
I love that.
Most of us, we all spend a lot of time in our cars driving. And for some of us, that's maybe the only time we really get to listen to music, other than those of us that do this all day for a living. So I do think that's a very important, valid way of listening.
Absolutely. I could just picture your car, 10 years from now, it being completely dead and just in the back of the studio,
sure.
Collecting dust, but you still got that stereo going.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'll keep it as long as I can, as long as as long as it turns on and I can run signal through that stereo, I'm good.
I love it. Well, that kind of ties into something else I was curious to ask about, which is that I know that a big part of your process, especially because you do have multiple studios that you bounce between, I know that you're using the Trinnov system as part of that. And for people who aren't familiar with it, it's a monitor correction tool. What are your thoughts on those kind of tools, especially for like the home studio musician who maybe doesn't have a treated room or, something that's ideal?
I think there are so many good options now. It's unbelievable. I mean, I have room correction even at my home studio. So this is the room I'm in now. This is my little fuck around room where I do my own music that no one's ever going to hear. So, but it's set up nicely. I have a pair of PMC 6.2s and I have a Trinnov in here. But before the Trinnov came, I bought a multimedia ARC just to try it because it was ridiculously cost effective. And it's amazing. Unbelievable. So I have nothing to do with that company, by the way, but I would say if you're mixing in a bedroom or in a less than ideal environment, I would give that a shot. It's unbelievable how cost effective and I mean how cheap these things are now. I mean, even some of the software options are pretty good when you have no other alternatives. Because I realize sometimes you're mixing, maybe you're renting an apartment or something and you're mixing in just a small back room and it's weird because the only place you can put your speakers is off in a corner and your left speaker's right up against the wall and the right speaker's up against a closet or a corner or whatever. And you're not going to be able to have any sort of real ideal listening position. And I think the room correction tools out there that we have now are just really good. Even Universal Audio has that built in now as an option. And it's that's amazing, pretty awesome.
If you're a fan of the Master Your Mix podcast, you might not even know yet that we actually have a full website packed with a ton of resources designed to help you make better mixes. So head on over to MasterYourMix.com, and on there you're going to find free downloads, cheat sheets, blog articles, books, courses, and a whole bunch more, all designed to help simplify your mixing process, give you more clarity, and help you finish more music without second-guessing every move. And then, if you're looking for more personalized one-on-one help, where I can work directly with you on your tracks and walk you through the recording, editing, and mixing processes step by step, that's exactly what I work on inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And you can learn more about that at masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can book a free call with me where we can talk through your current process, figure out where your gaps are, and identify the fastest ways to help you move forward with your tracks. And then if it makes sense to work together beyond that call, we can absolutely talk about that too. So once again, that's masteryourmix.com. And then for coaching, masteryourmix.com/amplitude. I mean, you've been at this for a long time and you've been making masters that have translated for years before I'm sure you even introduced any of this room correction stuff. So I'm curious to know, how did adding a system like that, how did that actually help you further?
Well, I added the Trinnov in... I'm really bad with dates and times, but I want to say it was around 2012. Maybe it was 2013. So at the time, I've been working on the same speakers since 2012. So I'm currently on PMC BB5 XBDs. So at the time, I was just on the BB5s without the extension cabinets. But Trinnov came and did a demo in my studio. And frankly, the first time I heard it, it just sounded alien to me. It was really confusing. I'd gotten so used to the way my room and speakers sounded. And then they left it with me and I started working with it. And it didn't take long to realize that I didn't want to work without it ever again. The ability to have consistency across different, different studios, just unbelievable. So I did in the last couple of years, I used to travel and I used to do some work in Los Angeles, and now I really don't do that anymore. I primarily just work in my main room. There are times if there's an emergency and I need to make a really quick tweak, I might do it from my studio at my house. But since all those studios have PMCs and trin-offs, everything's voiced in a very similar manner. And it's really easy to go from one spot to the other and trust what you're hearing. And then with the trin-off, there's all sorts of cool things you can do. You can bring your preset and load it up in any trin-off, so it'll have my EQ curve that I use. I have kind of a mild EQ additionally on the speakers. That's sort of what I'm used to hearing, and that translates through all the places that I work. So it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned a really good point there, which was that like when you first started using the trin-off, it sounded foreign to you, and that's, I guess that's always been the thing in my mind when it comes to like any of those translation or those corrective tools, is that like if I'm already familiar with a room and I've got a good sense of how it translates, like what am I really going to gain out of it? Because if anything, I could see the same thing happening where I would just get overwhelmed and confused by like, what's this new thing I'm hearing? And, this is what I expect out of my speakers. So, as far as, the advantage of having a system like this, did you find that like, because it sounds like you've added some EQ into your process too, into your presets to kind of balance out some of that stuff. Like, did you find that it, like sonically, what would you say were the biggest improvements that you heard?
The room phase correction was the most impressive, and it's sort of hard to really describe unless you hear it. Everything just seems more cohesive. The soundstage is bigger. I can more. The most important thing is that I can work, I'm not kidding, twice as fast as I could before the trin-off. I hear exactly what needs to be done instantly. There's no confusion. There's no, I know if the mid-range seems the low mids seem really muddy. I know that they're muddy, and I know it's not something with my room or my speakers. So for me, the amount of time I've saved just by using the trin-off has been invaluable. I couldn't go back to working without it. I wouldn't. And that has nothing to do with the room. If the room was perfect, I would still use the trin-off because it allows me to do things that I couldn't do before. Like, again, it allows me to do custom EQ curves. It allows me to switch the sweet spot to the couch if I have a producer back there who wants to hear things and wants to sit on the couch and doesn't want to sit in the sweet spot. So I'm so kind of dialed in to working that way. I wouldn't go without it. It's as important as my speakers.
That's very cool. So yeah, as far as, preparing for mastering, we've talked about, feeling more like committing to your mixes and, having a system that allows you to trust your speakers a little bit more. Then as far as like submitting files to you as a mastering engineer, do you have any specific guidelines that you tell people to follow in terms of what they're sending you, like any headroom issues or stuff like that?
Make them sound good. If you're happy with the way they sound, send them. I have a real bone to pick with mastering engineers that tell mix engineers and producers to send unlimited or quiet mixes. We're all working with digital audio. Like, don't send me a 3 dB down mix. It's like, I can I can bring it down 3 dB just like you did, unless you're bringing it down before processing because you want to give me a little bit more creative liberty, and that's what you want, that's fine. But in general, what I prefer to have in a perfect world, I would prefer to have unlimited mixes if, you're leaving me room to kind of sculpt stuff. And then I want to hear the limited or heated references always. Now that's a big thing. Always send your reference mixes with the master files. You don't need to send 24-bit. I mean, if you have an issue with the mastering engineer using those and you don't want them to use them for whatever reason, send MP3s. But I need to at least hear what the client's been hearing, because the client has approved the reference. They have not technically approved the mix. So if you've got 8 dB of limiting on it and some widening and extra compression and stuff, that's kind of part of the mix. We have to figure out how to either add that back or figure out the best approach, because if we master without hearing that, it's not going to be the mix. Even when folks tell me, they're like, oh, I barely did anything on the references. And then you find that I recently got screenshots from a client that had 14 plugins on their reference mix bus. Multiple EQs, LA2, a Fairchild, 2 different tape emulators, multiple limiters. I mean, a lot of that stuff is part of the mix. You're mixing
and in their mind, they probably thought they did nothing.
Yeah. And in my mind, that's not what mastering is. We're not just slapping a bunch of plugins and hoping for the best. So I always want to make sure, it's really important for me to hear exactly what the artist is hearing. So, but other than that, level wise, as long as it's not clipping, unless that's the way you want it, I can work with whatever you give me.
It goes back to what you said earlier, just about committing to the mix, right? If you've been listening to the mix with all that limiting and everything on there, then that is the mix. And so,
yes.
If you just strip that away and say, okay, here's the mix, it isn't the mix. It's something completely different.
It's not. When you're mixing into a limiter, you don't take that limiter off and send it to mastering. It completely changes the balances. That's no longer the mix. So it's funny because this doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, when I have someone I've had people they're mixing into multi-band limiters and like a lot of compression and limiting. And then they take that off and send it to mastering. And then all of a sudden you're left to like, oh, now I got to solve some fucked up puzzle. It's like, it's some sort of weird test. Like, can you get it to where I had it? It's like, probably, but it's not going to be, it might not be exactly the same. And also, what are we doing here? It's like, yeah. If you like that, let's figure out a way to make this the best we can. And that's why communication is so important. If you don't have like clear dialogue and communication between the engineers, the mixing, mastering engineer, and the end client, and everyone understands what needs to be done, and I understand their expectations, then maybe you're not going to be happy with the end product. So
for sure.
I mean,
for sure.
I'm fortunate enough that I work with a handful of engineers. We've been doing this for so long that 95% of the time, no words are spoken. Because we already hashed all that stuff out years ago. You know how it goes. Everyone knows everyone in the chain and knows what to expect. And, those projects are beautiful. But with with new clients, it's super important to establish that immediately.
Absolutely. So I think I know your answer and what it's going to be, but what's your take on stem mastering then?
Stem mastering's bullshit. It's bullshit.
That's exactly what I thought you were going to say.
I think it's fucking bullshit. Now, here's the thing. I'll do it if someone asks me to. And my rate's going to be a lot more than my normal rate because you're asking me to mix the song. If you're sending me 6 stems, you don't really want me to just keep everything at the same level. And, that's not, in my experience, most of the time people send in stems because they're afraid to finish the mix. They're just not happy with it. And they think, oh, they're doing me a favor by allowing me to EQ the vocals separately. And, it's like, you're not doing me a favor. I will work that way. And I will say there could be a situation where you have to, for some reason. And I've definitely worked off stems and sort of emergency situations where, like, for instance, maybe they sent us stems, but we were working out the stereo files. Then all of a sudden they need instrumentals and the mix engineer doesn't have time to do it, whatever. Or maybe we need to create edits or alternate versions. And there are times that can come in handy. And there have been projects that I've worked from stems and they have turned out great. But, you know, I mean, there was one in particular I did years ago where we ended up working from stems kind of at the 11th hour, just to, mostly we were remixing though, but the producer and artist gave me mixing credit on it as well, you know, because
as they should.
Yeah. So I don't think that I've been asked about stem mastering probably 5 or 6 times this year. And I think I did 1 or 2 stem sessions, but I realized that in those situations, I really just feel like they weren't ready to commit to the mix. My other problem with stem mastering is I don't advertise myself as a mixing engineer, but, you know, in my personal life, outside of being a mastering engineer, I spend all day at work, and then I come home and hang out with my wife and kid, and then I come into my private studio and I work on my own stuff and I mix. And to me, the mix bus is a very important part of the mix. So when I'm mixing, and again, I don't do this for hire, but when I'm mixing my own stuff, I am always mixing into a 2-bus mix chain. And that's one of the things you lose when you're working off stems. If you're doing it out of the box, I know that there are easier ways that you can still maintain that 2-bus on stems in the box. And I know a lot of people do it. I think Andrew Sheps has like a super crazy method for doing that and stuff. That's all part of the vibe. So, you know, stem mastering, it's like, I'm not a fan of it. I don't think it tells me the mix is not done. So I'll do it, and I can do it, and I think we can get good results, but I will always discourage stem mastering.
Absolutely. That's kind of what I thought you would say as your answer there. And I think it all makes total sense. And especially the idea of the master bus processing not being a factor in stem mixing or stem mastering. I think that's a really good reminder. So with all that said, then, like, what's your typical approach to like any new project that you get? Like, where are you starting? What are you listening for? What's that approach look like?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is just to listen. I think a lot of people forget that. That's the most important part of our job. So if I'm working on a record, a full length, the first thing I do is listen down to the record. So I'll usually start with kind of what I sort of call passive listening. So if my day's blocked out for, let's say, a 10-song record, I come in the morning and I pull up the project. Usually at that point, my assistant has set up the project for me. So I hit play and I listen, not like a mastering engineer for the first time. I just listen like anyone else would. So I sit down, I listen relatively low. I'll answer some emails for like the first 20 minutes. And this is sort of like a passive background listen. I'll jump around a little bit from track to track. And then I will kind of switch to active listening mode. So my philosophy in general with mastering is, I think one of the most important reasons you would engage a mastering engineer is for a separate set of ears and a fresh perspective. And I firmly believe that 95% of the time, the first impression is correct. So when I sort of go into active listening mode, that's where I am very quickly roughing stuff in, because I want to capture that first impression as quickly as I can. I don't need to commit to it, but I just want to get it down. I want to turn the knobs. I want to rough in settings, and I just sort of want to let my reaction dictate the action on the console. So most of the time, I feel like those instincts are correct. So I will go in and do an active listen that might just be a quick rundown where I rough stuff in. Then from there, I really go in and sort of dig in. But
Interesting.
I think the first listen is the most important. It's something that you're just never going to get back. That first, for me, going from the kind of passive listening, and also when I'm listening passively, I am not sitting in the sweet spot. I'm most of the time sitting sideways on my laptop, just trying to catch up with a few emails, just listening from the side. Because I find you catch a lot of things that you don't always strangely catch when you're focused and in the sweet spot. You'll hear those weird little things when you're like responding to that email. You're like, oh, there's that click I need to make a note of. Oh, why is that bass note jumping out like that? And I find it a really good way to sort of hone in on those things immediately before I sort of switch into the active listening mode.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because you said that the gut reaction is one of the most important things, and you described that as having a response to that in the active listening stage where you're immediately like going to tools and trying to correct things. But one could argue that that first passive listen was the first time you heard it. So do you find how often do you find yourself just like wanting to jump right into it? Or what are the things that you're hearing more in the passive listen than the active listen? Is it just more like the edits that kind of pop out in a weird way?
Yeah. I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes I end up, as I'm kind of in that sort of passive listening mode, there is a point where I'm like, I just get sucked in, so sometimes I might be 2 songs into sort of listening passively, and I'm like, oh, I know exactly what needs to be done, and I switch gears, and then from there I'm just in that gear until it's done, and for me that means not focusing on anything else. So I don't answer emails, I don't do any of that other stuff when I'm EQing and working on music. I need to just be in that mode, and I don't like to be removed from that, when I'm working on that. Yeah, I mean, every record's different. Some records immediately, I feel like you put them on, you know exactly what to do. Sometimes you're doing a lot, sometimes you're doing very little. It really is project dependent.
But I think that you bring up an interesting point of just the different forms of listening that the audience is going to have, and you're taking that exact same approach as a mastering engineer, where the majority of people are going to be checking their emails while listening to music.
Yep.
And so if anything's standing out to them while they're doing that, then that's obviously something that really needs to be fixed. And then there's the people like us that are more intent and sit down just to listen to music, and with that technical knowledge, these little frequency ranges and stuff like that we can pick out as engineers, but I'm sure most people don't really know any of that stuff. No. They just, they're just enjoying the music, but it's offering a different take, and not just that, I'm a mastering engineer, I'm going to just fix things for the sake of fixing things kind of perspective.
For sure. And, one of the things I try to keep in mind too is what may sound like a mistake to me might not be a mistake at all. So one of the most valuable things I learned from years of working with punk rock and indie rock noise bands and everything is what? That crazy sound that sounds like a tube going out on an amp, or the crackling in the background, that's supposed to be there. So it's important to understand the music you're working on. Obviously, if you're working on a delicate acoustic Americana track and you hear some crazy unorthodox noise, probably not supposed to be there, but I think it's important to understand what you're working with and, know what's supposed to be there. I'm a huge fan of really big organic records. I love hearing all the weird noises. I love hearing the amp crackle and, the weird guitar pedal fuck ups and stuff like that. So none of that stuff doesn't bother me. I don't want things to be perfect. I want things to be human, because art's not supposed to be perfect. You know? I mean, sometimes there are times where we have to, a lot of the time we have to dig in and fix things, but I also think it's important to really understand the material you're working on and understand the artist's intent and get out of the way when you need to.
Yeah, and I imagine too that with that passive listen, it also lets you know what can slide as far as those mistakes, right? It's like if you didn't notice them before, then there's probably no need to correct that stuff later on. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And as far as like the character and all that kind of stuff, like that was one thing that I noticed while listening to a bunch of tracks that you've mastered and various records. Like I found like listening to Weezer, Chris Stapleton, Rival Sons, like Jason Isbell. Like I feel like with those records, there's often like kind of this common like rawness to them, like kind of mid-rangey thing to them. It's gritty, slightly saturated, that kind of stuff. And I was curious to know if with those records, like, is that something that maybe came to you as more of a mix decision? Is that something that you've added a little bit more in mastering? Like what's your take on like infusing character in a mastering stage?
Yeah, I mean, across those projects, very program dependent. So, you know, a lot of the Weezer stuff I've worked on with Jake Sinclair has been a ton of fun. And there was a lot of room to kind of be creative and really push that stuff past where the mixes were. The mixes were already amazing. Just kind of gluing in a really cool, loud, aggressive vibe. And you know, some of the other project stuff I've done for like Isbell and Sturgill, I've been able to be really creative. I mean, I did a record with Sturgill Simpson a couple years ago called Sound and Fury, and man, we did a lot of work at the mastering stage. I mean, that was a good example of some intense mastering character. Printing all the mixes to my ATR and just slamming the hell out of the ATR. A ton of analog outboard gear. Some pretty creative decisions were made during the mastering process, and it's a pretty interesting listen. I'm really happy with the way that turned out, you know. But then, you know, there are other records that require a very light touch because maybe everything's already baked in. You know, I just did the new Brandi Carlile record, and that came in sounding amazing. And there was very little EQ on the record at the mastering stage. It just didn't need it.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like throughout all of the interviews that I've done, there seems to be like these two different camps when it comes to mastering engineers. There's people who think of it as like a technical, like kind of, you know, you're just getting technical with the tracks. And then there's other people that see it as more of this creative process. And I think there's definitely a time and place for both approaches. But yeah, I think like I guess it comes back down to what you said earlier about, you know, just having lines of communication with people to know what they're expecting. So you're not going to just add a creative flavor to a sound that they were already happy with. They didn't need that creative stuff, right?
For sure.
They didn't need the saturation and all that kind of stuff, right?
For sure. And again, yeah, you're right. That's where communication is key. So I want to serve the client and I want to serve the project. I don't ever feel like I need to put some sort of weird Pete Lyman stamp on it. Like, oh, this is the way I do things. I'm the guy that does this or whatever. That's not how I work. I want to do what's best for the song. And if that means slamming it through a tape machine and through some opto compression into a bunch of Pultecs and clipping the hell out of it for fun, then maybe that's it. Or if that means loading up these great mixes and deciding they need almost nothing and QCing them and wrapping the project, then that's what it is. You know, I've no ego in that way. And I know some mastering engineers don't believe this, and I might get some backlash for saying this, but there are times when mixes come in and your job is to QC the mixes. You don't need to reach for an EQ or processing all of the time. If the mix is good, you need to understand that the mix is good. And I think that there's this misconception that I've kind of seen online on some of the forums, like, oh, this person didn't really do anything in mastering or whatever, you know? And at one point I remember, this was years ago, I did a record for Chris Stapleton called Traveler. Amazing record. Most of the songs are flat with no EQ during mastering, with like the exception of one or two. It was that way because Vance and Dave Cobb and Chris Stapleton spent so much time dialing this in exactly how they wanted it. It sounded amazing. And you know what? Sometimes it just sounds amazing. You don't need to slap an extra layer of processing on it for your ego. And I think the hardest thing for younger people sort of getting into the mastering world is understanding that sometimes your job is to listen, QC, and make parts. Now, that is very rare. But when it does happen, you need to understand that that's your job. You know,
Absolutely.
You don't just start slapping processing on a track because you think that's what mastering is.
I think that it's just that people feel the need that like if they're getting hired, they need to do something different to show that it's different, you know. But it can go against everything that's great. So.
Yeah, I mean, our job as mastering engineers. Now, I realize this has changed a lot over the years, but initially, mastering engineers weren't allowed to EQ. Their job was to get the master tapes on vinyl and make sure it translated and was as close to the mix as possible. That was their job. Now, I know that it has changed a lot over the years, but still at the core of our job, we are the folks that we're the last line to make sure that this project is as good as it can be. You know, we can't make mistakes. You know, we're in charge of all of the production parts. We need to make sure this is going to translate, you know, as good as it can. And sometimes the mix is already there. So leave it alone. Again, that's pretty rare, but sometimes it is. And you just need to understand that it doesn't need anything else. The only thing you could do is make it worse.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like I've always found that sometimes when it comes to mastering, like the better a track is, the harder it is to master. You know, because
Sure.
it's like there is that feeling of like, what do I do with this? And you're like listening. It sometimes forces you to like try to find problems that maybe don't exist, and so it's that battle of like, is this actually an issue or is this my ego telling me I need to do something different?
I think everyone struggles with that. And as your career develops, when you start to work with more professional engineers, I mean, I definitely struggled with it. You know, I went from working on crazy indie noise pop records and punk rock stuff to pop records and big country records and big rock records. And, you know, if you're mastering a record for Michael Brower, he's got a pretty good idea of how he wants his record to sound, you know? So sometimes it's just already there, or it's 95% there.
For sure. And it makes sense too, because you're working with people who, at least at that level, like you're working with people who are doing this day in and day out. They've heard a million records that they've worked on that have been mastered to their tastes. So they have their ears refined enough to understand and appreciate what a finished track should sound like. So they're chasing that finished sound right from the get-go.
Yep.
Whereas like someone who's getting started doesn't have that confidence, still doesn't know their processes very well, that kind of thing. And so there is a lot more room for error, I guess, or a lack of confidence in what they're doing. So yeah, it's
and I think that's okay. I mean, established mixers that, you know, kind of getting back to the conversation we were having earlier, like mixing into a 2-bus chain or mixing into limiting. If you're in a really nice tuned room and, you know, you've had a million hits on the radio, you understand how everything should sound, and you're mixing into a limiter, you have the experience to know how that's going to translate. The problem with less experienced mixers doing that, or someone that's doing that that's not in a tuned room, is that at that point, that does make it harder for the mastering engineer to address any issues because everything's so baked in. So again, that kind of gets back to the communication thing. We keep coming back to that. It's all about communication. So in a situation like that, that would be the time where maybe I would have a conversation with the mix engineer, not necessarily asking them for something different, but telling them, the struggle I might be having or the issue. And sometimes it's maybe a change in the mix. Sometimes it needs to be fixed in the mix, But again, the communication is very important.
For sure. It's funny because before we hit record, we were talking about Jack Emblem. And one of the things that I've heard him talk about many times is that, like, in a lot of the music he works on, there's this fine balance of even adding drum samples where you don't want to step on the toes of someone else's vision for, what drums should sound like. And so from a mastering perspective, do you find it hard to make suggestions to a mix engineer of like, oh, we should tweak this because it'll help with mastering? Or does that not apply as much to you?
That is a can of worms. In general, this is not a hard and fast rule. I will say in general, unless a mix engineer or a client asks for a critique. Now, I will always do a free mastering critique. Before I start on a project, if you want me to hear your mixes and if you're soliciting an opinion from me, I will happily do that. But I'm not going to do that by default. It's not my job as a mastering engineer to critique your arrangement or your song or tell you, oh, that vocal's too loud. It's like, well, maybe it's supposed to be, and this is all music. It's all art. It's personal taste. Like for me, it's funny because one of the things that really took me forever to sort of adjust to when I started working on modern country, especially the pop country stuff, was the vocal is just like right here all the time, like karaoke style. And again, I come from a punk rock background. All we were doing, when I was playing in bands, we were all so terrible at singing that we just buried the vocals. So, a lot of the music, it's just as all guitar, loud drums, vocals barely audible, So much of it is a personal taste thing. I think, and I have told people that it is my opinion, if a mastering engineer goes back to a mix engineer and insists on a remix or insists take your 2-bus processing off or your limiting off, my default response to that is you should fire that mastering engineer. They're not doing their job. I think it's offensive. A lot of the big mastering engineers I know, they all have stories about this. Like, and these are people that know what they're doing. They're like, yeah, I had to do some tracks with so-and-so, and they called me and told me to, remove my 2-bus processing or send them something else or lower the bass or whatever. It's like, fire them, I mean, it's different. If an independent client is asking me their opinion, I will happily give it to them. We can have that conversation. I love working that way. Ultimately, I want the best mix because the best mix is going to make the best master. And if a client is interested in my opinion and I feel like we have a similar aesthetic and vision and I can help them with that, I will gladly help them with that. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I'm never going to go and tell a mixing engineer that they don't know what they're doing. That's a terrible precedent.
Yeah. So then, having talked about like doing a gut check earlier in that active listening stage, that gut check is often going to be dictated by your personal tastes. So how do you see the role of a mastering engineer versus, personal taste and that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, that's something that you have to learn, and it can be a struggle in the early years. You have to understand, again, we're talking about sort of the modern country vocal. Like years ago, that was foreign to me. Now I just dial right into it. I know exactly what's supposed to be what's supposed to happen. That vocal in that pop country song is the most important part of the song. It's the vocal. It's everything. So again, where maybe my background, it took me longer to adjust to that sort of sound. Now I'm totally tuned into it because I understand it. It has nothing to do with like personal preference at that point. I understand what they're trying to do. That's it. Like, I don't even have to like the music I'm working on. In fact, I joke sometimes it's almost easier to not be that connected to the music you're working on. You know, sometimes if I like the record too much, I find it's almost, it can be really, really difficult at times to separate those two brains. Now, I'm not saying that I love the records I work on. I don't mean that, but I don't mean to say it like that. But what I'm saying is, like, I guess I'm not trying to make a judgment on whether or not I like the music. So oftentimes I find with a lot of the records I do, I don't really get to like and enjoy the records until I've finished them and get to listen to them when they're released. Then I can enjoy them in a different way than I could have when I was working on it. When I'm working, I'm working. I'm not developing an opinion on whether or not I like the style of the music or the artist. I mean, I am fortunate that I would say almost all the stuff I get to work on is all stuff I really enjoy and I really like, but I'm not really worried about that when I'm working on it. You know, I'm worried about, I want to understand what their intention is. Is like, is this a rock track? Is this a heavy rock track? Is this an Americana track? Is this like a modern country track? Like, what are these supposed to sound like? So obviously if it's like a gritty, you know, like a gritty sort of Americana thing, then that's going to sound different than a modern, it's going to sound different than like Dierks Bentley, you know? And all that stuff is cool. It's just different. Like if I'm mastering a Dierks Bentley track or if I'm mastering a Charlie Crockett track, those are both super cool, but so different. And you have to understand the intention. You're talking about something more modern versus something that's has like more of a kind of old school vibe. And you have to understand, but you have to connect with that. And again, at the time, I'm not necessarily worried about, I'm not listening like a fan. So I want to serve the music.
Of course. So then, in your mind, what ultimately makes a great mastered mix?
A great mastered mix is, you know, the most important thing is balance. You know, good balance within the instruments and good general like frequency balance should sound pleasing. Most of the edits and everything should be tidied up, and it should have the heart and soul and the vibe baked in. Like if you're not if that song doesn't move you when you hear it before it's mastered, no amount of mastering is going to make it get over that mountain, you know? So that's the most important thing. I mean, when it gets right down to it, honestly, even that shit doesn't matter. The most important thing is the song. Again, like I keep going back. One of my favorite records ever is by this Minneapolis band called Husker Du, and this record called Zen Arcade, recorded in the early 80s. It sounds like it was recorded in a tin can and mixed through 2 rat pedals. Terrible. Sounds terrible. It's my favorite, probably in my top 5 favorite records of all time, because the songs are unbelievable. So, you know, the best mix, if the song's not there, who cares? Who cares how good the mix is, you know? I'd rather have a good song all day and a real mediocre mix. So we are trying to translate emotion. And also, let's face it, most end users, we're getting back to the people that are in their cars or the people that are doing their dishes and listening to music. They're trying to find an emotional connection. They're not like, oh, fuck, the snare shit on this song. It's terrible. They don't care. They don't even know what the snare is. Let's face it. Like, we're also used to dissecting mixes. We're like, oh, the bass guitar is too loud. Or like non-musicians, most of them couldn't pick the bass guitar out of the mix. Like, and I don't think they should. They're enjoying the music. They want that emotional connection. They want the memories that go with listening to those songs. So ultimately, yeah, we can talk about balance and all that stuff, but if the song sucks, who cares? You know, we're trying to make great art, and our job is to take that piece of art and present it in the manner that the artist intended. That is the most important thing. There's a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of technical stuff that we can get into the weeds about, but at the end of the day, I feel like people just keep forgetting this is art, and that's what it should be. That's the most important thing.
Of course. Pete, I think that's a great spot to wrap things up. If people want to learn more about you or potentially even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
You can just go to our website, infrasonicmastering.com, shoot us an email, give us a call. We'll take care of you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for hopping on. I really appreciate it. It's been great to learn more about your process and your way of approaching mastering. And I think you bring up a lot of really great points that people are going to listen to this and take great information from. So thank you so much for being
on this. Thanks for having me.
So that was my chat with Pete Lyman, and I thought that he brought up some really great points around the idea of committing and how when you don't commit to ideas, when you don't commit to decisions, there's just so much room for things to go sideways and room for your vision to just fall apart. You're leaving so many decisions in the hands of someone else, potentially in mastering or maybe even in mixing, to try to build that vision. But if you're not even clear on it yourself, that's a problem. So you need to get clear on what it is that you want things to sound like. And when you do that, every decision throughout that process is going to be based on that vision. So you're going to know what mics to use, what techniques to use, what level you're going to want your vocal compared to your drums and all that stuff. Like all of these decisions are always going to come back down to that vision that you established very early. And if you don't have that, you're going to really shoot yourself in the foot. And when you commit, you make more progress. You know, like done is better than perfect. You're never going to really reach perfection. So, you know, it's always a good idea to just move forward. And there's also that saying that is like, perfection is the enemy of progress. And I can't agree with that more. When you don't commit to anything, you never actually finish. You never make any progress. And you end up stuck in this state of limbo where things just don't get done. Whereas if you actually move forward, if you just commit, even if it's not the right decision in the end, but even if you commit, you're at least making progress. And you're going to learn from that previous experience so that next time you don't make it and you end up getting stuff done faster and improving your mental Rolodex of what is acceptable for your tastes and what's not. And it actually allows you to improve as a mixing engineer or improve as a mastering engineer because you're getting things done. And if you just constantly are in this state of second guessing your decisions, you're going to be stuck there forever. So learn to commit, even if it's not always the right decision. I mean, obviously you want to try to make the right decision, but let's face it, there's a lot to learn in this field and there's a lot of mistakes that you are going to make. So make them and learn and move forward, right? That's what this is all about. And I think that towards the end of the episode, Pete also brought up a really interesting topic, which is that none of this stuff even matters. Like when we're talking about recording, we're talking about editing and mixing and all that stuff. None of this even matters if you have a crappy song to begin with, right? So we have to see this vision as this big process where everything you do leads into the next step. So you have to write a great song. And then when you have a great song, you can go into recording. And the better you record everything, the easier it's going to be to edit everything. And then the better you edit, the easier it's going to be to mix. And the better a mix, the better the process is going to be in mastering. So it's all this big process where you're going from one stage to the next, and it always has to be done to the best of its abilities before you move on. And so if you drop the ball at any of those stages, you're going to really do yourself a big disservice. So always have that vision early on in terms of what you want your music to sound like, write a great song, and then from there, follow the production process and do it right at every stage of the way. And this is something that I talk with my students all the time about. I see so many people that come to me saying, I need help with mixing. But then you listen to their tracks and mixing actually isn't the problem. It often has to do with the fact that they've just made bad decisions in the recording stage, or they've poorly edited their tracks and everything sounds off, or there's like clicks and pops like we talked about in this episode here, or just the song sucks. And so then we have to go back to the drawing board and we have to work on our arrangements and stuff. So it's something that you just always have to be very mindful of, like this whole big vision of your song and how each part of the puzzle comes into play to make it the final result that you want. Now, with that said, if you are someone that doesn't have confidence in this stuff, if you're constantly second guessing your moves, if you're not getting the results that you want, and you want someone that can help guide you throughout that process and give you feedback, give you pointers in terms of your arrangements and your recording techniques, and guide you as far as which mics to use, what kind of positions to put them in, how to edit your tracks properly, how to mix your tracks properly, how to do it fast and keep organized and all that kind of stuff. That is exactly what I work on with my students on a one-on-one level inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details of the program there. And on that page, there's a link where you can book a call with me. It's a free call. I'd love to learn more about your music and what you're working on. And I'd love to learn more about the challenges that you're facing with mixing and see if I can identify any parts of your process that could use some extra attention, and to see if I can help you. If I can help you, I'd love to talk about my program and what it would look like to work with each other, or I can just give you some direction in terms of where you should focus your energy on. But either way, I'd love to hop on a call with you. So again, if this sounds interesting to you, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details of the program there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode, so thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.